Welcome to the Etsy Conversations podcast, featuring inspiring interviews with Etsy shop owners, hosted by Ijama Elazu.
Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Etsy Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Ijama, and I thank you for joining me for another episode. If you're in the Etsy Conversations Facebook group, then you probably saw the live session where I talked about wholesale and selling wholesale on and off Etsy. And I mentioned to you I'd be having a guest on the podcast who I was going to talk about wholesale in, especially if you're despairing about selling wholesale through Etsy. Never fear, my guest this week is Emily from Wholesale-In-A-Box. If you haven't yet heard about it, you're about to learn everything there is to know about Wholesale-In-A-Box. And if you've ever considered going the wholesale route, or if you already are and are looking for other ways to branch out, this is the episode for you. Emily, thank you so much for being my guest and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so good to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you could be on. I think the timing of this conversation is really great because, as I alluded to, I know that, and you're probably also aware of this, that there have been some changes on Etsy, and folks who are who participate in Etsy wholesale or who are thinking of branching out into wholesale might need some additional resources. And so I'm so glad that you're here and that we're going to talk all about that and what you guys are doing over at Wholesale-In-A-Box. I am so excited to learn more. But before we do, can you just tell us a little bit about you and Wholesale-In-A-Box and how it came to be and just everything?
Sure. So Wholesale-In-A-Box is a subscription service that helps makers get their work into stores. And the way it works is when makers sign up with us, there's a set monthly fee, and then for that fee, you get three things. You get handpicked store leads that we pick store by store, maker by maker, a system, an online software system for how and when to contact stores, and then unlimited wholesale coaching and support by phone, by email, and there's a course also. So it's a method that we've seen work really well for makers to get into stores and a tool to get into stores faster and with less time on your end, which is great. For a lot of the makers we work with, as you can imagine, are a one-woman shop and doing a lot. And so what we want to do what gets me up in the morning is being able to help passionate people do what they love in a more sustainable way. And so for a lot of people, wholesale is a part of that vision for, when people think about, okay, I've been on Etsy or I've been in craft markets and people love what I do and I love what I do. But for this to be sustainable for me over the long term, financially and emotionally and in terms of my energy, a lot of makers look up one day and they say, okay, this is great, but for this to be a long-term thing, I need to be in stores. And that's actually, you asked how we got started. It's one of those things where we never could have envisioned Wholesale-In-A-Box a few years ago. And yet I think in a lot of ways, everything we've done over the last 10 years has been leading up to it. Really? So my co-founder and I have worked with natural skincare companies that went nationwide and artists and producers and, hundreds of makers and artists, but we kept noticing this one obstacle that makers had, and we kept hearing the same thing over and over again about needing to grow their wholesale business. And so we just kind of saw this opportunity to use our past experience and our passion to help maker businesses do the work that they love, but grow wholesale so that it can really support their families and be something financially rewarding too and less draining. And so at this point, we started 3 years ago, and we've helped 400 makers grow their wholesale business
Wow.
by getting into, independent boutiques across the country.
Yeah. Now, Emily, at what stage do you think a maker is ready to work with you? Should they already be dabbling in the wholesale industry, or is a good time to come to you when they're still doing the one on no I don't know if one on one is the right word, but if they're still doing the single products, and do you coach them through how to scale?
Yes. I would say that when the minimum that someone needs to get started with us and really to get started growing their wholesale business is a great product
Mm-hmm.
and a compelling story and some online representation of their work. It even could be an Etsy store or an Etsy
Mm-hmm.
wholesale line sheet, something that, even if they don't have a line sheet or a catalog yet, but something where store owners can go to look at the line. So that's the minimum.
Okay.
It is great if a maker has already, started engaging with people, especially store owners, about the work, maybe approached a store or two locally, or done a ton of craft markets. And so
Mm-hmm.
just a sense that they've done a bit of experimentation or poking around to see what the response is to the line, especially in a store setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but, my favorite part of what we do is coaching people, just as you said, through the process of what's a line sheet? Do I need a line
Yeah.
sheet? What do I say to stores? Like, what is this whole thing? And making that simple and accessible. So many people that start with us definitely don't have any of those pieces in place and then create those as part of the process.
Okay. Okay. Typically, what would you say is the timeline from when someone first starts to dive into wholesale, or I should say walk into wholesale, to the point when they're fully ready to start making their products available for retail?
Well, that depends. People can do it a lot faster than they think. I
Mm,
think
okay.
I find that the way the market is right now, it's better to jump in quicker and then evolve your materials and your approach based on the feedback that you're getting,
Mm-hmm.
rather than taking 6 months to get all of your pieces in place perfectly and then jump in. So I almost feel like it's, once, if you do have a great product and you have been engaging with craft markets or a couple local stores,
Mm-hmm.
you can get your pieces in place, your line sheet, your pricing, and your terms. I mean, you can do that within a week, right? Is
Right.
it going to be the end version that's perfect? No. But based on the feedback and responses that you're getting from stores, you're going to be able to make the perfect version a lot more effectively than trying to do it all from the start.
Okay. Now, would you say that wholesaling, as in going into the wholesale arena, is for
Mm-hmm.
everyone, or are there some business types or product lines that are not well suited for scaling up to wholesale?
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons. We talked a little bit about the reasons that wholesale could be a great fit.
Mm-hmm.
Scaling in a sustainable way that's less draining,
Yeah.
not being at the mercy of a single platform like Etsy, evening out seasonal swings, all of that, right? So those are all the reasons that it could be good. I think there are some reasons that when wholesale is not a good fit for a maker. So number one is if the product can't really compete nationally.
Mm-hmm.
There can be products that are wonderful on a local basis and they're wonderful, sell well at craft markets,
Mm-hmm.
but then there is nothing uh, so unique about the product that when they move up a level nationally, they're able to compete with thousands of other people making that same item, right?
Okay.
And so that's not necessarily by category. It could be a soap maker that is able to compete nationally and a soap maker that's not able to compete nationally.
Okay.
But I would say that's one thing. The other thing is if you're still at the very beginning of your product development and understanding. So if you haven't done any craft markets or any trunk shows or haven't really engaged with the work at all, that could be very tricky, obviously. Another thing is margins. Often we can work together to figure out a way to adapt your pricing and or your products and or your production to make your margins work for wholesale. But rarely, sometimes I'll come across a line that just doesn't work because of the way the pricing and margins are.
Okay.
And then I would say two other things that are maybe strategic or mental factors that make wholesale less of a good choice are, one, if you already have a large stable business that's working just great on other channels, sometimes it doesn't make sense to kind of branch out and try wholesale. So if you're doing great, sometimes it's better to double down on what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing is if you're very impatient for immediate growth, because one thing we have found about wholesale is that it can be transformative for a maker's business. We see people go from $20,000 in revenue to $250,000 in revenue, hire their husbands on full time, all of those things. But it doesn't happen in the span of 1, 2, and 3 months. It happens in the span of 1, 2, and 3 years.
Okay.
And so I think that if you're in a place where you're ready to invest in that kind of long-term growth and that's good, that's what you're looking for, then it can be great.
Okay. I like that because that sets a very realistic expectation of how one should approach getting into this arena. Would you recommend that a seller who is already on Etsy, because say someone is listening, they're already selling on Etsy or thinking about selling on Etsy, have multiple venues that they're already selling on if they want to go into wholesale, or is it better that their products are less accessible prior to venturing into wholesale? So should they have an e-commerce website as well already, or does it not make a difference?
I would say that it's not a necessity to have your own e-commerce website in addition to your Etsy site, but it's certainly an asset.
Okay, good to know. Because there's always that struggle, with, should I create my own space on the web for my product, for my business, or should I just stay here where the traffic is already there and is kind of in a way brought to me, and it's less work on my part to exist on this platform.
Yeah, and that's a perfectly reasonable choice. A person could say, Etsy's working great for me. I'm going to have an Etsy wholesale line sheet, and then I'm going to do wholesale outreach on my own.
Yeah.
And that works too.
Okay. Let's talk about what happens when one branches out into wholesale. So now you're not just running a business to customer business. You're now operating in the business to business arena. Let's talk about time management and what kind of changes one has to think about when it comes to marketing as a wholesaler versus marketing direct to customer.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that come to mind for that. These are all good principles for anybody, but I think you're right that when you're doing wholesale, there is a level of planning and consistency that you need to get under your belt to be successful with it.
Okay.
I think there are three things that I think of when it comes to business shifts and time management. One is not trying to do everything yourself. And for makers, this is sometimes hard because I think makers picture, either I do everything myself or I hire on a full-time employee.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just encourage people to think about hiring at tiny scales. So can I hire somebody for 3 hours a week if I'm not ready to hire more than that?
Okay.
Can I hire a college student to come by an hour a day? And so to give yourself a ladder upward by having people help you out at smaller scales.
Mm-hmm.
Or hiring services. I think for a lot of people hire Wholesale-In-A-Box, like I hire in quotes, right? Hire Wholesale-In-A-Box as a service instead of hiring a production assistant because it saves them a lot of time.
Yeah.
So considering, are there services that could help me too, even if I'm not ready to hire people full time?
Okay.
Another thing I think, and we were talking about this before we started recording, but scheduling time blocks, batching things.
Yes.
Once a day or once a week to do the things that will move your business forward. Mm-hmm. This goes back to consistency. With an Etsy shop, I think there's a little bit more of a constant rhythm of things that need to happen every day and every week. And with wholesale, there are things that it's almost like there is a lot less urgent that needs to happen to grow the business, but the things are important that they happen consistently. So like we always encourage people to set a 2-hour wholesale outreach time block on their calendar every week, Friday afternoons, and just to do it every single week and put in that time.
Yeah.
The third thing is to schedule times to reassess, say quarterly, but not reassess until you get to those times. And again, this goes back to the kind of slow build of wholesale. A lot of people are really excited to jump in with wholesale, and week one, they're so very, ready to go.
Yeah.
And then week two, they're emailing me, I haven't heard back from anybody. I haven't gotten any orders. And, I would say, well, why don't we put something on the calendar for 3 months from now to step back and see how things are going and if there's any tweaks we need to make. But until then, just carry through with the plan.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm sensing that there is, or there should be, a lot of patience baked into this whole process. I
think that's right. Yeah, because there are these incredible ripple effects from growing wholesale. When you get, if you live in Denver and you get into a store in Nashville, you're reaching people that would have never come across your brand otherwise, press and customers. And so then that can spread out from there. And so the ripple effects of each store that you get, they start to snowball. But if you don't give that time to happen and you're frustrated at not getting results in a week or a single month, then it's just not you're going to cut off the growth that could have happened, I think.
Okay. Now, Emily, one of the things that I ask a lot of sellers that I talk to on the podcast is how involved, if at all, they are in craft shows or trade shows or vendor fairs. And you've mentioned that a couple of times already. Is it necessary for a seller to do trade shows or craft fairs in order to start to scale their business? I know you mentioned it as a way to get some experience under one's belt with, just getting your product out there and seeing how the market responds to it. But is that something you'd include in the recipe for success for one who wants to get into wholesale?
Well, there's so on the one hand, there's craft markets where you're selling to individuals, and then trade shows are where you're selling, where store owners come and then they're shopping. Right. So no, I don't think either is a necessary ingredient to growing wholesale. Okay. If a maker does not have their product locked in and is not yet seeing a lot of success in terms of sales, I think that craft markets, where you're selling direct to customers, can be a powerful way to experiment enough and get that feedback to get locked in on what their product and pricing needs to be.
Okay.
But if you're already kind of past that, then for sure it's, you know, it's possible that you don't need to continue doing them.
Okay.
And I know they can be draining and tough for a variety of people, you know, if you have kids or a job or whatever. So no. In terms of trade shows, so trade shows used to be the, as you know, I'm sure the way to grow wholesale. They have changed dramatically over the past several years. They've remained really expensive, so it usually costs between $15,000 and $20,000 all in to do a trade show.
Wow.
And they have become a bit of a gamble for a small business, where they're hit or miss in terms of whether you're going to get any orders, how many orders you're going to get from stores. So for the most part, I don't actually even recommend doing trade shows to makers unless that $15,000 to $20,000 price tag is a small expense to them, you know, where it's not a gamble and it can work or not work, and it's not that huge of a deal, which is not the case for most makers with the revenue that they have.
Yeah. I'd like to talk a bit more about the service that you provide at Wholesale-In-A-Box. You talked about, if you don't mind us just going into a bit more detail, just so folks know exactly what you offer. One of the things you talked about was that you provide coaching and support for your subscribers. Can we first talk about what type of coaching do you offer? And then what type of support? Is it, when you say support, do you mean phone support, email support? Is it technical support when it comes to dealing with retailers that are reaching out to your subscribers? What's involved, basically, is what I'm asking in the coaching and the support that you offer.
Yeah. Good question. The answer is kind of all of the above.
Okay.
It's our favorite part of what we do. So the general idea is we want to do absolutely everything we can to remove your obstacles to growing wholesale.
Okay.
So the way that looks is different for every maker, but it can look like wholesale coaching calls. When makers sign up with us, they get a scheduling link to my calendar and can set half-hour wholesale coaching calls as much as they want. It can happen via email. So maybe it's sending your line sheet or your email to stores over to us for detailed feedback or line editing or even a rewrite. And then every maker is also part of this wholesale kind of foundations course that goes over what we've seen work best when it comes to line sheets and emails and wholesale terms and all of that, to kind of cover all the bases. It gives, you know, examples and templates for line sheets and emails. So it happens in any or all of those ways. A lot of our makers find the wholesale coaching to be the most valuable part of the subscription. Actually, it's you know, sometimes people don't sign up for that in the first place, but then it ends up being really helpful for people.
Yes, and I would imagine too, I will take having a guide over just guidance, if that makes sense.
Right.
Like I would take being able to talk with someone over just going through, you know, a course or instructions on how to do something.
Well, right. And, you know, sometimes people ask me, you know, oh my gosh, you know, for $119 a month, you give unlimited phone coaching.
Yeah.
Because you know, when I would do consulting before, I would charge, you know, about $200 an hour for business coaching. So it's like, how does that add up? But the truth is, we can get through so much in 30 minutes that is so helpful for makers. And, you know, we don't need to be on the phone. I'm available, but we don't need to be on the phone all the time. If we can hash through sometimes makers tell me, oh my gosh, I've been struggling with that for 2 years and we just figured it out in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's exactly that. There's just no replacement for one-on-one collaboration on something.
Absolutely not. Now, what is, and I know this is kind of different or will be, I'm assuming, for everyone, but how do you measure success, and or what should the measure of success be? And like I said, I know it will vary for different people, but in general, how would you measure whether or not someone is successful at what they're trying to achieve?
Well, I think, I measure it relative to their goals.
Okay.
When people sign up with us, we ask them what their goals are, in the next 3 months, in the next year. And everybody has different goals. Not everybody wants to 10 times their business. Some people want to grow more than that, and some people want to grow a lot less than that. So that's one thing, is suiting it to how an individual maker wants to grow, both in terms of size and in terms of type. Are there kinds of stores people want to be in, specific types of stores they don't want to be in, and everybody's different.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. Generally, though, on our end, what we obsess about every day is how to help our makers grow their wholesale business, which we usually count in terms of number of stores that they're in.
Okay.
It's not a perfect number thing, because reorders, how many times a stockist will order from you over the course of a year, in many ways is even more important than the number of stores that you're in. But we look at both of those and try, everything that we do. When we work with a maker, we sit down on a monthly basis and reflect on each individual maker's progress over the last month and say, okay, how can we build on what worked for them last month in terms of the stores that we select, in terms of the coaching that we give, so that they'll be even more successful next month.
Wow. I love the boutique style approach that you take to Wholesale-In-A-Box and your subscribers. It's getting more and more rare nowadays with with everything going digital and with technology just, taking over. I mean, I'm sure you use technology, but the hands-on approach that you have to it, I think, is impressive. Now, what if somebody is listening and wondering if their particular business is a good fit for Wholesale-In-A-Box? What do the businesses that you work with look like?
Well, they look all different ways. There's a page on our website that says Our Makers. So people can go there to get a little bit of a sense of the variety of makers we work with. It's a range of styles, from super minimal and modern to something much more eclectic or traditional. And it's also a range of products, from clothing to bags to paper goods, shoes. I mean, everything. So the stores in our portfolio that we pick and then send to makers as leads vary dramatically. The 20 stores that you would get are so different from the 20 stores somebody else might get, because the aesthetic and the product are so different.
Okay.
I would say the common thread is certainly a quality of product and a uniqueness of product, and a compelling story. And so that doesn't have to mean some big dramatic unique story that's been in a newspaper or something like that. Absolutely not. But a maker being able to articulate what makes their product different from something that a store owner could buy, from a distributor, that might be mass produced and might be cheaper. So if a maker is not able to stand out in that way and not able to tell that story at all, then it's challenging.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. What do you find are some of the most common mistakes that you see Etsy sellers or other creative business owners in general making when it comes to running their creative businesses or their handmade businesses. And I know you can speak to this because you started out on Etsy. So you have experienced that and have a sensitivity to sellers on Etsy.
I think there are a few things that I see, Etsy sellers making as mistakes. One is not experimenting enough. So sticking with the same thing, whether it's the same pricing or the same set of products, over and over time, but then getting discouraged when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
The most successful people I see try small, inexpensive experiments of new products or new pricing or new strategies for outreach. And then, as they work, investing more time and more money into those things.
Okay.
Sometimes I see people not taking their work as seriously as they might in terms of the kind of mechanics of it, their structure and their schedule and their finances and kind of getting organized. That's something that we do a lot of at Wholesale-In-A-Box too, because the software is preset with the outreach that you need to do for each store. And it's so funny because it's not, it's sort of like none of us should need that. We can create that for ourselves, but it's so helpful to have a little bit more structure, I think, especially as a creative person.
Oh, yeah.
And then I would say the third mistake I see people make is isolating themselves from critical feedback that would help them refine their line. Wondering about their market or their pricing, but then not actually talking to store owners or not doing, say, a trunk show at a shop. It can be scary, but it's just so worthwhile.
Oh, yeah. Actually, it's so funny you say that because I recently had another guest on who said that as well. Basically was encouraging sellers to reach out for feedback and critiques on what they were doing because of the value of having outside eyes look at something that you've been looking at for so long that you don't see the holes.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So one of the things you mentioned was outreach. Do you have any advice for sellers about how to go about getting organic or even paid exposure for their products outside of Etsy?
Well, if you're ready for wholesale and that's part of your strategy, direct outreach to stores can be great. And that's what we help people with, whether that's via email or via snail mail. So that's like one whole universe of things. I do find we spoke a little bit about craft markets, not trade shows, but craft markets.
Yeah.
They can be a good complement to Etsy as well as to wholesale growth. It's interesting how I see this in my own business too, that channels kind of build on each other. So what you do on Instagram builds on your Etsy and vice versa. What you do with the craft market builds on Etsy and vice versa. So thinking about, it's a balance between focusing, but then also diversifying so that those things can support each other.
Yeah.
And then the third thing, and this is something I know a lot less about, but have seen be successful. So I don't know if you know Maypac from Creative Hive.
I do. Yeah. Not personally, but yes, I do know her.
She's great.
And in my head, we're friends, but I've never spoken with her.
Yeah, me too. She has worked with us at Wholesale-In-A-Box in the past, and she helps folks with active outreach to blogs and press. And that's, something that I haven't done a lot of, but she is very passionate about that being a very powerful channel for Etsy sellers.
Yes. I know she had, I know she was not had, but that was actually how I discovered her, was through, I was looking for, just information about how to get exposure, and that's how I stumbled on her. And she's just a wealth of information when it comes to that. That is her thing.
Yeah.
So when you say she helped, does she work with you inside of Wholesale-In-A-Box, or you just use some of the or you not use, but you
Oh no, she was just one of our makers at Wholesale-In-A-Box.
Oh, okay. Oh, fantastic. Oh, great. Now, for Wholesale-In-A-Box, is there any type of maker that might not be a good fit?
Well, yeah, I spoke to this a little bit earlier. It's not so much by type,
Yeah.
but more by, and this is hard for people to assess their own. And people can also feel free to email me and give a link to your website.
Yeah.
I am honest, kind but honest if I think it's not going to be a good fit.
Yeah.
But it generally has to do with whether the product is able to stand out and compete
Yes.
at a national
You
level.
did say that. Right. Now, Emily, having done this for a while now, do you have any specific tips for Etsy sellers to help them grow their businesses, and outside of wholesale, just in general?
Yeah. I would say, just connecting back, and these are good reminders for me to reflect on too, as I consider myself a creative business owner also with Wholesale-In-A-Box. The things I always try to remember are putting in place regular reflection times, a little bit each day, a little bit each week, a little bit each quarter, to reflect on your business, the concept of working on your business rather than in your business,
Yeah.
even for 5 minutes a day.
Yeah.
I think experimenting with something new every quarter, I always try to, try something that might not work. And it doesn't have to be a big thing, but just a little investment to see if there's an opportunity that I hadn't noticed before. And, I'm kind of a broken record on this one, but I think putting yourself in a position to get feedback and see results of something and then act on it.
Yeah. Great. That's all very helpful. Now, Emily, for that seller who is on the cusp and they think they're ready, but they're not really sure and they have some additional questions, what's the best way they can get in touch with you to get any more questions or doubts out? What's the best way they can connect with you and just maybe get some more information?
Sure. We are super available for that. If you go to our website, wholesale-in-a-box.com, we do have, a video of the system and more information about how exactly it all works. Also, email us at team@wholesale-in-a-box.com. We'll get right back to you. Whether it's a specific question that you have, or like I said, if you want us to take a look at your line and see whether it's a fit. Also, we can often set a call to discuss in more depth if that ends up being helpful.
Okay. All right. I will have links to everywhere you can find Emily. It's wholesale-in-a-box.com, and I will link to that so you can watch the video and get an inside view of what is included in a subscription to this service. And also I will have a link to Emily's email, or the email for the team at Wholesale-In-A-Box. They are very responsive. I can attest to that. So feel free to reach out to them. Emily, thank you so much for sharing all this information. Like I said, I'm so glad that you were able to talk with me about this, because I know right now with changes going on at Etsy, it's just so comforting to know that there are options for sellers who want to go into wholesale, and the fact that you have such a hands-on approach is very encouraging, and I do hope anyone who is on the verge of considering going wholesale will reach out and connect with you for more information or to sign up for the service.
Thank you so much. I love your podcast. It's an honor to be on it and to get the chance to talk virtually to your listeners. And, if I can be of any help with anyone as they're exploring wholesale, please reach out.
Absolutely. And I thank you for listening to the podcast. I will be back next week. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by The Seller's Resource, available at thesellersresource.com. The Seller's Resource is a brand new resource that I have created for Etsy sellers. It's an all audio content library of tutorials about how to sell on Etsy, and also all the updates, information, and news coming out from and about Etsy that sellers ought to be aware of. That's The Seller's Resource, available at thesellersresource.com. I will have a link in the notes for this episode.
Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, and while you're there, please leave a review too. Visit convome.com to leave a comment or feedback on this episode.